Our next presentation this morning is by Dr. Marta White from Georgia State University. Dr. White's the program director for both the study abroad in transition economics in China, Russia, South Africa, and for the business Mediterranean style study abroad in Greece and Turkey program. She's also the director of the Robinson Honors Program and the director of Robinson Business Learning Community. Internationally, Dr. White has lectured at the Ronald H. Brown Institute for Sub-Saharan Africa and the University Pantheon Sorbonne. She is a recipient of several teaching awards, including the 2004 Outstanding Teacher at Georgia State University, the 1999, 2003, and 2009 J. Mac Robinson College of Business Faculty Recognition Award for Outstanding Teaching, and the 2002 Board of Advisors Teaching Excellence Award, the 2002 International Education Excellence Award, and the 2005 Master Teacher Certificate Award. Dr. White's keynote address is Communicative Praxis in the Age of Globalization. Dr. Marta White.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm certainly honored to be here. Thank you. And that was a really interesting presentation. I think that as we evolve as a species, we realize more and more that partnership between industry and academia is important. So, very nice. Today, I'm going to talk to you about an article that I wrote here. And just to give you a little bit of background, one day I got the AIB, which is Academy of International Business newsletter. And in it, I'm reading that there's a Decade Award that was awarded to Keith Brothers for his work that he did, obviously, 10 years ago. And I thought, wow, Decade Award, that sounds really intriguing. I need to read about this. And I did. And I read through it, and I was inspired by what he said. But then I thought, one of the variables that he talked about just, to me, didn't make sense. I thought I had some other ideas about what some of his variables should be. So that's what this presentation is going to be about. Oh, yes, okay. So the name of it is Communicative Praxis in the Age of Globalization. I thought that it might be important to look up what the word praxis was. So the origin comes from, in case like me you didn't know, it comes from the ancient Greek word that refers to activity engaged in by free men. So Aristotle thought that there were three basic activities of man. And he categorized these as theoria, poiesis, and praxis. Now these correspond to three different types of knowledge. Theoretical, which is the end goal, the truth. Poetical, which the end goal was production. And practical, where the end goal was action. Now, he divided practical knowledge into ethics, economics, and politics. And then he distinguished between what he called good praxis and bad praxis, eupraxia and dyspraxia. Now, of course, this paper is going to only focus on the good praxis, the eupraxia. And what I'm trying to do is link it to communication, which, as I read, the philosopher Calvin Schrag says should always be entwined with communication. So I happen to agree with him. So it's inspired by the Gibbs Journal of International Business Studies, very, very well-known journal, as many of you are aware, for his Decade Award, Institutional Culture and Transaction Cost Influences on Entry Mode, Choice, and Performance. So Professor Brothers was recognized for this influential, innovative, and really impactful work published 10 years ago. So I thought I would build on his framework, and in this paper I'm proposing the addition of another variable to what he calls cultural context in his model, and he had 3 variables in his model. And I'm suggesting that cultural context may be broadened to include what I call a within-culture communication style and measure. So what I'm suggesting is one of my passionate models, as some of you may know who have met me before, and that is the LMR, the Linear Active, Multi-Active, Reactive Framework, by using cross-cultural tools known as Culture Active or ICE, and ICE stands for Intercultural Edge. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about these just in a minute. But let me give you a little bit of background about the Brothers article. So he spoke of 3 overarching variables. He spoke of transaction cost, where you identify potential partners, negotiation, and monitoring costs. Remember, we're talking modes of entry, so entry into foreign countries. And the cost of identifying these new partners, the cost of negotiating with these new partners, and then the cost of monitoring the enterprise. Second variable was institutional context, and here he refers to the legal restrictions on foreign ownership. And third, the cultural context, he's looking at market potential and investment risk. And when I read these 2, I thought, wow, that's interesting, but I don't know how much that really relates to the cultural context. I had some other ideas. Now, the cultural context variables look at these 4 areas. They look at profit conversion, for example, repatriation risks, the nationalization risks, how similar the cultures are, and then conditions in the political, social, and economic environments of the country. Okay, so here's a diagram of the 3 variables, the transaction cost, the institutional context, and the cultural context, and a brief summary of what each variable is measured as. Okay, so you can see transaction cost, identifying the potential partners, negotiating and monitoring, the institutional context, the legal restrictions, and then the cultural context, referring to the market potential and investment risk. So, what Brothers did by including the cultural context, and this was something new that he did, because previous researchers had not included a cultural context variable. So, definitely new territory here. And he did this because he wanted to focus on market potential, meaning investing in a country and achieving economies of scale, depending on the market, and the location-specific costs, meaning investment risks within that context, within that country, and therefore what the resource commitments would be. Specifically, under the cultural context variable, looking at investment risk, you can see what the 4 variables were here, and the profit potential. And this was measured through a Likert-type question that was focused on the target market's potential profit. Now, what I'm proposing is an addition to the cultural context, and that is the LMR framework, the linear active, multi-active, reactive, which would look at a within-culture communication style variable. And I thought that was an additional component, an additional dimension that would enrich this framework. So, when Brothers looked at his research questions, he looked at entry mode, and the dependent variables in his study were either wholly owned subsidiaries or joint ventures. So what was the choice that organizations made? What was their entry mode preference? And he measured these according to subjective data, looking at management performance evaluations, only when the objective measures were not available. So, some of his results. When entry mode was predicted by his model, which was the transaction cost model, firms performed better than firms whose entry mode choice could not be predicted. And he had 6 hypotheses, and here I detail his hypotheses, and these are the 4 that were supported, 2 were not supported, which will be on the next slide. So he did find support for the fact that firms that perceived that there were high transaction costs, remember transaction costs, meaning the finding, the negotiation, and the monitoring, tend to use the wholly owned subsidiary mode of entry. Okay, so they tend to enter markets where they set up operations in a greenfield venture. The next hypothesis dealt with firms entering markets that were characterized by lots of legal restrictions, and those that perceived that there were lots of legal restrictions tended to use the joint ventures, so the partnerships, the strategic alliances. The next hypothesis, firms that perceived that there were high levels of investment risk, so those tended to use the joint venture again. So if there were lots of legal restrictions, or if the investment risk was high, then joint venture mode was the choice. And finally, the entry modes that could be predicted by his model, using all 3, the transaction cost, cultural context, and the institutional context, tended to perform better than those whose choices could not be predicted. Now, there were 2 hypotheses that he did not find support for, and those were firms that made high asset specific investments tended to use wholly owned modes of entry, while firms making low asset specific investments tended to use joint ventures. No support for that, and just to clarify, asset specificity deals with the level of firm specific technology. So firms with greater technology, he thought, might incur higher transaction costs because they were trying to protect their technology. Okay, but again, he did not find support for this one. The second hypothesis that he did not find support for were the firms entering high growth markets tended to use wholly owned modes of entry, while firms entering less rapidly growing markets tended to use joint ventures. Okay, and here he was looking at market potential in terms of profit potential, which is a component of cultural context in his view. And he thought that this might influence the mode of entry because it impacts the market capacity and the opportunity costs. Okay, but again, no support for these 2. Don't you just love these bubbles? I love this. Okay, so LMR, linear active, multi-active, reactive. The rationale, my rationale, thinking through the growth of globalization, and with globalization, implicitly, corporations have to make mode of entry choices. So what I'm saying is the praxis, practical application here is that adding what I call a value-added criteria in cultural context, using the LMR framework to measure the communication styles within countries would enrich this framework. And I'm proposing that we measure this through either culture active or ICE, intercultural edge. So, if we were to do this, then the hypothesis would be that entry mode and mode performance are more predictable when LMR classifications, LMR linear active, multi-active, reactive, between home and host market actors are more similar than different. Okay, so if you are expanding into countries where there's more similarity in communication styles between home country and host country, then the entry mode will be more predictable than when there are differences. So a little bit of background on ICE. Intercultural Edge. This emerged from another cross-cultural assessment tool called Culturactive. And this came about when issues of validity, reliability became increasingly paramount. Now, both of these come from a man by the name of Richard Lewis. Richard Lewis is not an academician, he's a practitioner, and he's authored two really famous books, which you may have heard about, When Cultures Collide and The Cultural Imperative. And here, he did these in response to explaining the challenges that were brought about in explaining national, international, and transnational business cultures. So he saw that cross-culturalists were grappling with this explanation of how to classify, how to categorize different cultures, Hofstede being the most widely cited. Many of you, I'm sure, know about him. And still there were issues with all of the classifications. So he conceived this LMR framework. And from this LMR framework comes Culturactive and later ICE. ICE is a collaborative initiative between the Fuqua School of Business at Duke, the Richard Lewis Communications, and Culturactive.com. Culturactive and ICE are web-based products that teach cross-cultural awareness in business settings by focusing on individual cultural profiles, which are then compared to national profiles. And they're done so by comparing them across linear active, multi-active, and reactive constructs. A little bit of background on what each one of these means. Linear actives are characteristic of cultures which are very task-oriented, plan, organize, schedule, pursue basically one thing at a time. Typically, we think of cultures from Germany or Switzerland. That would be linear active. Multi-actives are cultures which are much more lively, loquacious, multitask, prioritize according to the importance or the thrill. Typically, Italians, Latin Americans, and Arabs would fall into this category. This is according to Lewis now. Reactives, and this was a new category, one that no predecessor had come up with. So Lewis was the first to categorize reactives, and these were cultures that prioritize courtesy, respect, listen quietly, and react carefully. For example, Chinese, Japanese, and Finns. I'm sure that we all know people who fall into these categories. Here are some more details about these. If you look at just the top row for linear active, multi-active, and reactive, okay, linear active talks half the time, multi-active talks most of the time, reactive listens most of the time. And then if you look at the bottom row across, linear actives, truth before diplomacy. Truth is the most important, no matter what. Multi-actives, flexible truth. Well, it depends. And then reactives, diplomacy is the most important. More important than truth. And again, I think we all know people who fall into these categories. When one takes the cross-cultural assessment tool called Culturactive, then this is the summary that takes place for the responses of individuals. So these black dots would represent individuals and where they scored on this cross-cultural assessment tool. And what's really nice about this is if you do it in a class, which I do many times, then you can see where the class falls in terms of this LMR framework. If you do it for an organization or a department or a team, it helps you figure out where the perspective, where the communication styles are for your group, whether that's class, whether it's an organization, whatever. And it gives you a perspective of where to focus your message, whatever that message is. Just as a side note, what I found really interesting is that those people who are somehow involved in business, whether they're entrepreneurs, run their own business, or work for a large corporation, or whether they're business students, MBA programs, typically, people who are involved in business tend to be more linear active, tend to fall down into this portion of the triangle. Significantly so. And that's just an interesting side note. So, looking at this framework gives you some ideas for how to communicate with your organization. But what I'm proposing in this paper is that it would enrich the paradigm that Brothers has come up with, and that he or someone may include this additional variable with his cultural context. Okay, here's another sample of the results that you would get through the Culture Active assessment tool. Now, the strength of the Lewis framework is it really transcends works that came before him, previous works, because what he's doing is focusing on the individual rather than the nation state as the unit of analysis. The focus of this model is communication, which often is the impediment between and among cultures. And as such, it's really a key consideration in globalization and mode of entry considerations. I'm saying it should be a key consideration. So commensurate with exploring, expanding, energizing international education and globalization, I think such cross-cultural assessment tools equip both academicians and practitioners with communicative praxis and cross-cultural capital. I think it can enable us to communicate even better and perhaps analyze modes of entry choices better. Prior theoretical frameworks for studying cultural differences included various researchers, most notably Hofstede. And here I mentioned what I mentioned to you a minute ago about the differences between those people oriented on business and those not. So, between business, non-business people, there seemed to be a result that could perhaps help the Brothers framework as well, where business people are much more focused on the linear side of decision making. And perhaps if incorporating this LMR framework into the Brothers framework, we might be able to better capture and predict mode of entry globalization decisions. So, we may have an enhanced proxy for cultural context through this LMR framework, and we might look at yet a second question, English language, because the other thing that previous research has found is that the language of delivery, one's native language, may result in differences. So if decisions are made in English or if communication is in another language, whether that's one's native language or not, may result in different outcomes in terms of modes of entry. Oops. So, in this paper, I'm suggesting the application of the LMR framework to Brothers' paradigm because I think it would help to more robustly explain the cultural context. And in so doing, it provides a communication praxis approach to an important globalization decision, mode of entry. by adding the within cultural communication style variable to what Brothers already looks at in terms of cultural context. In this way, the cultural context would be broadened and enriched by adding the LMR framework to measure the within culture communication style. And again, the hypothesis would be entry mode and mode performance are more predictable, because that's what he's talking about throughout his paper, when the LMR classifications between home and host market actors are going to be more similar than they are different. So, I think questions are to be asked later during the presentations that we have throughout the day. And I think this is my last slide. Yes, okay. So I'm tying this back into the communicative practice of the age of globalization, which we all live in and hopefully prosper in. So thank you very much for your time this morning, and hopefully I will see you later this afternoon and we can have more detailed conversation about this, which I look forward to.